Oh,
Hey, oh, boo.
boo. I'm scared. Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
This is Rick Beyer in Chicago. And Chris, this is an encore episode of
Yet
History
again.
Happy Hour.
Yep.
Meaning we
Well,
are not here.
No, we're definitely not.
We are
may-
not live, exactly.
No, but
We're not
we
dead,
wanted to be.
exactly. But
We're just traveling the globe.
we're just traveling out there, and History Happy Hour is brought to you by Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And even
Which
though
we
we're traveling
appreciate.
the globe, we do try to virtually be here, even if we can't physically
We're here
be
in spirit. Yeah.
to have a cocktail and talk some history with you. And today, what is our encore episode about today, Chris?
Well, just to emphasize the fact that History Happy Hour is just so cutting edge that we're on top of current affairs, we've decided to revisit the Russo-Finnish War because, as has recently come to light, Finland has applied to join NATO, and there are some current parallels with past historical events, so we thought this might be a timely reminder of that.
So we're History Happy Hour, ripped from the headlines.
Exactly. When we get the BBC News alert here, we get this really great jingle that goes, and then you quickly check your phone to see what the news is. We should do something like that for History Happy Hour.
Instead, we'll just go with the drum roll in the open. How's that?
Okay. The bar is open.
The bar is open. What do we got on tap today?
Well, on tap today, we have a really interesting story with a wonderful guest. Our guest is Dr. David Murphy, and Dr. Murphy is a lecturer in military history at Maynooth University. He has lectured at the Dutch, South African, and U.S. military academies and the U.S. Command and Staff College. He's written numerous books, including Breaking Point of the French Army, the Nivelle Offensive 1917, Lawrence of Arabia, lots of wonderful things on the Irish military experience and the Irish military diaspora. He's a fellow of the Royal Society, and most important, he's an alumnus of History Happy Hour. And he's joining us tonight to talk about his new book on the Russo-Finnish War. So,
And there's the cover.
Finnish-Soviet War.
We got it. The Soviet-Finnish War. We want to know about the Russo-Soviet War. That was a little earlier. David,
I'm sure it'll happen, Rick.
I'm sure it will happen.
never had an intro quite like that, I'm sure. But welcome again. Welcome back. And, I keep forgetting to ask our guests, so I'm not going to forget this week. Did you bring a drink? What are you drinking?
I did bring a drink. I was going to, well, first of all, hello, everybody, and thanks for having me on again. I was going to bring a very large Irish beer. I was going to bring a Guinness, but I didn't. I just brought some whiskey in a glass with a bit of soda. That's all. Very boring, very boring.
I think that'll tide you over.
Chris, what are you drinking today?
Just a good Camden Pale Ale.
Well, I want to just say that I anticipated, David. I took care of you. I brought the Guinness. Okay, I brought the Guinness. So, in your honor, and although it's Irish and not English, it's drunk in England. I've seen it drunk in England. I believe some people at Wembley may be drinking it today. So I will drink it in honor of England as well. But Chris, get us started.
Yeah, so the Russo-Finnish War it's an odd beast. It's this amazing David and Goliath story, but it's not really well known or well known enough. So one of the questions I have is this a separate war, or is this just a smaller conflict that's part of the larger war? And if you could probably answer that question really quickly, and then maybe set the groundwork for.
I think in the context of its time, of its moment, I think Stalin thinks it's a separate war. I think when he initiates this, he thinks that this is going to be a rather short affair, 3 weeks or something like that is his initial kind of like prediction. So I think he sees this as a short kind of Russian conquest of Finland, that there will be no retribution, there will be no further fallout. And it's all just part of that Russian expansion into the Baltics and now into Finland. So I think it's his design is a short, separate affair, but then it becomes because of Finland holds out for over 100 days. There's a lot of international attention, media attention, there's League of Nations attention, and then obviously various Western nations start sending help and volunteers and equipment. So it starts getting meshed into the wider context of World War II, and then obviously from 41 onwards again. The Finns will actually kind of like side with the Germans when Barbarossa kicks off. So again, they take a side at that moment in time. That's where they're going. So I think it's a yes and no. It's a yes and no answer, Chris. I mean, I think it starts off as something small, local, and then it just grows and grows, and then it gets meshed into that bigger context of World War II.
I'm going to put up a couple of maps here to help orient people, and this is a map just to show. Basically, for those of us who are geographically challenged, where is Finland? And you see it's the purple thing in the middle, and the Soviet Union is part of it is the big orange thing to the right, blobs, as we say. And if we close in a little bit on that map, you'll see how close Finland is to Leningrad, which the Soviets are obviously real concerned about protecting. And there's a little mass of purple land there near Leningrad, which is the Karelian Peninsula, where a lot of the fighting takes place. David, to follow up on Chris's question, what are the issues that lead to this war, and what's kind of the Soviet plan?
Well, it's quite interesting because in the 20s and 30s, the Finns and Soviet Russia have actually they have a modus vivendi getting on. So they have non-aggression pacts, the friendship pacts, and it is, they seem to have a reasonably decent international relationship between the two of them. But once we start moving up towards World War II, and obviously Poland's invaded in September of 1939, Stalin then basically pressures the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, into non-aggression pacts and basically gets Soviet troops on their side. So what Stalin was actually trying to do is create space between him and the West. Okay, so a de facto annexation of the Baltic states gives him space in that department. He also wants to push Finland back from his borders. He reckons they're too close to Leningrad. He also reckons if you look further north, they're quite close. They're kind of like their Arctic territories. They're quite close to Murmansk and Archangel, right up there in the north. That you can see it there in the map. That small strip that Finland has coming out into the Barents Sea at Petsamo. He wants to push them back from that as well. So essentially, it's trying to create a cordon sanitaire, as we would say, as the French would say, along a buffer zone along his borders of one of the Baltic states between him and Germany, and then also if he can bring Finland into the Soviet sphere, he's got a considerable buffer zone up there. Bear in mind that Finland, the Grand Duchy of Finland, as it was Russian territory up until 1917, the Russian Revolution, and I think it's in December 1917 they declare independence. So there's a long history of association between them and Russia, and not unlike some of the maneuverings we see today with Putin's Russia. This idea of trying to get influence in states that abut onto you and also maybe used to be part of your territory. It's the same kind of motivations.
So one of the things that I found really informative in the book and very interesting was some of the background about Finland. So I didn't realize really what a new country it was. And so maybe you could describe kind of a little bit about what has gone on in Finland and how it becomes a country, and how ready are they for this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting, in the 20s and 30s, it's a very interesting country. I mean, they come out of, as I said, they were Russian territory up until 1917. Basically, when Russia collapses and they opt out of Russia and they are pressured to join the new Bolshevik state. Stalin is actually sent on a mission in 1917 to try and talk them into staying, and they decide not to. There are what we would refer to today, I suppose, as elements of right wing and left wing in the country. They fight out a very bitter civil war in the early years of the kind of like the Finnish state. But by 1920s they have relative peace. They also have prosperity for the first time in well over a century. It's a prolonged period of economic prosperity. So they're growing as a nation. They are becoming more and more conscious of their own culture, their art, history, language. And that, in many ways, that's a plus. But in other ways, there are aspects. In Karelia, there are ethnic Russians. In other places, just over the frontier, there are ethnic Finns. So there are tensions and there, cross-border incidents throughout the 20s and into the 30s as well. So it's, in many ways, you can look forward as being positive, but in other ways, it's quite tense. And then in the mid-1930s, they've signed non-aggression pacts with treaties of mutual friendship with Russia. Mid-1930s, they start feeling the pressure, and they have not invested in their military. This is a huge issue within Finland. They've been quite successive governments have not invested in the military. And I think when you look at good case study is to look at Mannerheim himself, who will eventually be president and is also commander-in-chief of the Finnish Army during this period. But when you look at his lineage, his ancestry, he has a German-Swedish background. He has served in the Tsarist army in World War I. He then becomes basically the de facto leader of the right faction, the white faction in post-war Finland. And he has a lot of experience there in various different armies. He has close contacts with the Germans. I mean, the Germans will actually send aid to the Finns in March of 1918 to push back Bolshevik forces. So there's a lot of different kind of influences in and out of the country. I think you can see that in his own history and his own conduct. Very, very delicate balancing act where you think of where they are. They are avowedly neutral. They try to engineer basically a collaboration between Norway, Sweden, and Finland as a kind of like a cohort of neutral countries in the Scandinavian region, and they get signaled very, very strongly from Moscow they are not to do this. So it's territorially it's in a crossroads, and it's a very, very difficult place to be.
David, I think that if people know anything at all about this war, the Soviet-Finnish War, they know that the Soviet Union invaded Finland and everybody thought it was going to be a walkover. Stalin thought it was going to be a walkover. Probably most of the military leaders in the rest of the world thought it would be a walkover. But then we have those plucky Finnish ski troops, and everybody's fighting in the snow. And suddenly the Russians, who have more soldiers, more tanks, more airplanes, they are just jammed up, stuck. So what happens? Why does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you play the numbers game, if you just stack up the numbers, it looks like it's a done deal. And I think you look internationally as well. You look, like the British government, the French government are initially slow to send help because they don't think they're going to have to do it. It'll all be over. I mean, the Finnish army fields in the entire war about 300,000 troops. The initial Soviet wave, the first deployment, is 425,000. So there's an American superiority there. That will go up to over 3/4 of a million.
Soviet superiority, right.
Yeah, Soviet superiority. I mean, it'll get up to 760,000 plus by the end of the war. So in kind of like the manpower game, and whatever you want to take, the Finns have about 30 tanks. The initial Soviet deployment of tanks is over 2,000. Mostly those T-26s. By the end of the war, they will have deployed over 6,000. Similarly, in air power, I mean, the Finns have about 100 aircraft, and the Soviets are looking at it in thousands. And when they plan this up, the initial plan looks upon this as a 3-week kind of like operation. They have scheduled in kind of a victory parade to coincide with Stalin's birthday, which falls in December.
Always a good plan to schedule the victory parade before the invasion.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing. I mean, when they initially come over, the lines, it's not so much in the Karelian Isthmus, but further north. The Finns are kind of like hitting them up and stopping them and overrunning columns, and they're finding that the Soviets have packed things like brass bands, instruments, musical instruments. They haven't got winter clothing. They haven't got cooking facilities, but they've packed. The band is coming. The band is coming. So it's bizarre stuff like that.
We're getting the band back together in Finland. So.
Yeah, exactly. We're going on tour. So there's just an incredible level of hubris. They just reckon they're going to roll over. And what it breaks down to, I mean, there's so many reasons it goes wrong, but I think, very, very poor leadership from army commander level downwards. And, when you look at, they have all the aspects, they have all the elements there of modern armored warfare, but the troops have not trained in how to do it. They're not polished enough to actually run this kind of campaign. And it all starts, the wheels start coming off the trolley, or in this case, the tanks. But it's just, numbers are actually not going to do it. And even when you look at, say, the territory, if you look at the maps there, I don't know if you have that second map. Yeah, I mean, this is how it's supposed to roll out there. You can see there's a Russian army at the south going to come across Karelian Isthmus, going to hit that Mannerheim line, break it, and then basically take a left down towards Helsinki. Okay, you've got another army further north going to hop over there at Lake, kind of like to the side of Lake Ladoga, and then you've got two more. That army, that third army at the top, is supposed to sweep in and cut the country in half. And then they're going to seize Petsamo in the north and basically Lapland. Technically speaking, that's not a bad plan. But when you look at how the roads in some places are just, one vehicle wide, you've got a whole cluster of lakes there. I don't know if the listeners can see those lakes. And it all breaks up. The Soviet army starts channelizing it into specific areas, and they become incredibly vulnerable as to weather. And bear in mind as well, they timed this for end of November. They're heading into an Arctic, kind of like an Arctic zone winter. So you couldn't have timed this possibly worse,
Well, but it's still starving. I mean, you have a lot of the Soviet commanders who had been in the Civil War. More of them had been in the Spanish Civil War. So there's some military experience there, and that what struck me is, even with all that, just how poorly they perform. And was there anything that you found about kind of how the Soviet army was being run or conditioned, or what was going on? I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, I think when you look at the army, there's just two phases of the command. Right? To be honest, I think the first team that they actually, Voroshilev and Yakolev and those guys, they've served in the Russian Civil War. They have a certain amount of experience, but they're not 18. Okay, not 18. And as we all know, and your listeners will know, a lot of the people who were 18 have just been purged in 37, 38, like the Chuchevskys and the Alexander Svechins and those really, profound thinkers are gone.
Right, it's always a great idea before you start a war to kill off thousands of your officers or tens of thousands of them. Right, that helps.
Yeah, that helps. I mean, they kill off, and even apart from this war and apart from their operations in Poland, there's a planned expansion of the army going on. They're planning to expand the army by millions, and yet they're killing off officers and sending officers to gulags at the same time. So there's a huge shortfall in leadership. Obviously, as well, if officers are looking at people being gulagged or executed, liquidated, it doesn't really inspire combat initiative in the battle space, really. So leadership, I think, is a problem. Also, the quality of the troops. I think there's evidence we can see that some of the units, some of the divisions, were actually raised in the Leningrad district only 3 or 4 weeks before this campaign started. So there's been no proper training. There's problems with the Russian training regime in general, because they don't have general kind of like infantry schools, artillery schools. Soldiers get trained when you go to unit. So their training is very, very haphazard. So that's a problem. That's a further problem. And then just basically troops not being up to speed with using their equipment, no forward fire controllers, no proper liaison. They have thousands of aircraft, but there's no proper liaison from ground to air to call in airstrikes. No proper winter clothing. They don't even paint the tanks white. And, how much time have we got? I mean, it's a very long list.
Keep going.
It's a very long list of
it almost seems like they didn't even expect to face opposition, that they were just...
Yeah, they're expecting, When some of the journalists that come across, there's an American journalist, Carl Meidens, and he talks about this like he comes across the tail end of an ambush, and all the trucks are just facing in towards Helsinki, kind of idea. They're all driving down the road towards Helsinki, and nobody seems to have thought about, flank security, forward, kind of like people on point, nothing like that. They're just bounced and cut up.
So maybe Stalin thought that if I launch 500,000 men at Finland, Finland will go no mas and surrender.
Yeah. I think, probably at worst, he thought it was happen for a week or a couple of weeks. I mean, they actually announced the war by bombing Helsinki there's no formal declaration of war. The Russians send in bombers and bomb Helsinki during rush hour. So that's the announcement. So there's a bit of terror. There's a lot of numbers. I'm sure he thought that sometime about week 2, the Finns would kind of go, oh, look, there's enough of this.
Yeah.
Can we be Estonia too? Can we be Latvia?
Can I bring in Jim Latton's question here, Chris? Because
sure.
we're talking about the Soviet shortcomings, if we shall say that. And Jim asks this question. He says, invested more effort in party indoctrination than military training. And that is an aspect that you talk about in the book, of that you've got these commissars, the party commissars in every unit. And so you have maybe more concern about who's being politically correct in 1940 Russian terms than in who's being a good fighter.
I think absolutely, and they have. The whole commissar idea that you actually, platoon and company commanders have to run a plan past the commissar for his approval before they can actually instigate an action. It's where I think to a modern ear, it's just bizarre. But in terms of, yes, there's a lot of political indoctrination in the ranks, and the flip side of that is that the Russians actually have developed a doctrine by the mid-1930s on how to do modern maneuver warfare. That's not being taught. Okay, that's not being taught. But how to be a good Soviet citizen is being taught. That'll only get you so far out in the future.
In fact, they killed off the guy who developed that strategy.
He's purged. He's purged.
So, but contrasting that, you have the Finns. Again, it's a new country, so a new military. How are they preparing for this? What's kind of the state of their army? They must be, even though they're very patriotic, they're seeing this Soviet wave coming at them. How are they able to withstand that? And not, they have incredible resiliency, but I'm curious where that comes from.
That comes down. There's a few different things. I think in the weeks beforehand, you can see the diplomatic mission is desperately trying to save time, just to create a bit of space in the whole system. But in terms of their military system, essentially is based on conscription. They bring people in for a year, sometimes over a year's training. So that's an initial level. There's very regular reserve training that tends to be local. And this helps them because when guys are activated, they're going to actually end up fighting in essentially their own backyard. So they know the ground, and that helps. They seem to be exceptionally good at just the field craft and being able to survive in winter conditions. That helps them as well. The terrain, the geography is a major factor here between lakes and forests that very much control how the Russians are going to move and how they're going to develop attacks. So that's a major issue as well. But a lot of this, the Finnish have a term at sisu, which is their kind of like their term for what the French would refer to as élan or cran. It's guts, it's courage, and the Finns seem to have a lot of it. Very good marksmen, very basic weapons, and sometimes and quite innovative as well. In the early phases of the attack, when the Russians show up with tanks, most Finnish soldiers have never even seen a tank, let alone practiced in how to take one out or how to operate with one, in terms of infantry support. Never seen one. So people do panic and run. But they realize that the Russians are sending their tanks forward without infantry support. They realize that makes them vulnerable. And then they start coming up with all kinds of ideas to actually kill those tanks. So there's a level of ingenuity and innovation there, and they're just dogged. They're just dogged fighters. So a lot of different factors come in there, Chris. Yeah, and good leadership as well. I think when you break down the DNA in the officers, a lot of the senior generals who are now have say corps or divisional command have been of World War One service, have fought as a group to fight with the German army. And then in the interwar years, a lot of them will do kind of staff courses in Paris, Leavenworth, going over to Camberley. So they're keeping ahead of the game. So some very good kind of senior level commanders, some very innovative kind of like company and kind of like battalion commanders. And it gives them an edge, Throw in minus 40-degree weather there, and that'll help.
That'll help.
Yeah, the weather is a huge factor, and of course, we also need to mention here, very important to mention that the Finns have reindeer on their side.
And
I don't know how big a factor that is, but I mean, not too many armies are fighting with reindeer, so that is and that's being funny, but the serious part of that is although the Soviets obviously live in cold temperatures as well in the wintertime, the Finns are really acclimated to this idea of being out in the country and in the winter and fighting there.
Yeah, I mean, they have that culture. They even still have that culture of getting outdoors as much as possible, and a really terrible Finnish winter doesn't put them off doing that. They find that even kind of city dwellers would be able to do cross country skiing. They obviously have the reindeer, so they can move around. I mean, situations develop where Finnish troops are moving around, moving equipment on sledges, moving heavy machine guns and sledges, and they have a certain amount of mobility. They are moving with kind of like tents, like heated tents. So they can get kind of like get out of the elements for so many hours a day. In some cases, they even build their own saunas up around the front line. I mean, that sounds bizarre, but you have battlefield saunas in around the Mannerheim line where it's more static. And this just bewilders the Soviet troops, the Russian troops. They're fighting to survive. Some of them are in these columns, and literally the clothes they're standing up in is all they have, and maybe a blanket. No heated tents, very kind of, unit size, battalion size field kitchens that the Finns then will target with mortar fire and machine gun fire and take out of them. So they're freezing. The Soviets are freezing and starving. They're gathered around in some of the locations. They're gathering around bonfires at night. And the Finns are moving around seemingly at will, killing their sentries and infiltrating their camps. I mean, there's a whole psychological warfare element in this war as well, which is interesting to think about.
So, David, you go into some detail about a specific tactic the Finns use. I think it's called Moti or Moti. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because you say they use it very effectively, and it gives them some pretty great successes.
Yeah, the Moti. I mean, a Moti in Finnish language, Finnish culture, is a cubic meter of wood. Okay, it's a measure of firewood. So you get, you prepare for winter. You say, I need 20 of these, but it's a measurement of firewood. So it's this whole idea of chopping something up into a smaller portion. So particularly in that kind of in around what's known as the Rat Road, where you've got a long column, Russian column pushing in, of maybe 2 or 3 divisions. What they will do is they will contrive a roadblock situation and a confrontation on one end. Then usually quite often at night, they will kind of like break into the column, basically separate elements by infiltrating the column, build another roadblock quite often. Yeah, this is great. I mean, this is along the Rat Road here. And you can see that basically, if the red line is the Russians, they're basically kind of splitting it up into smaller groups, okay? And it's blocking at both ends, it's building roadblocks in the middle, it's separating the whole column, and they don't have the numbers to overwhelm it all at once, but what they will do then is move parallel to that on ski through the woods, and they will destroy those pockets one by one as it suits them. And just the column disappears. I mean, in that particular action, on the Rat Road, I mean, basically 3 Soviet divisions disappear, and you're talking about 20,000 men just become casualties. It's just phenomenal,
And this is a horrifying picture of some of the
Yeah.
Russian casualties on the Rate Road. And one of the questions that we've gotten from a couple of different people to bring in involves what are the total casualties in this conflict? And Lynn Kennedy asked the question, how much loss was there on both sides, and she asks, and did the Finns prevail? Which I'm afraid, Lynn, not to ruin the story for you, but they don't.
No.
But what are the casualty figures here, roughly?
Yeah, no, sadly, the Finns do not prevail, but they do give the Russians quite a bloody nose. But it all goes pear-shaped for them really in March of 1940. But the casualties now, in terms of Finnish casualties, Finnish killed in action is about 26,000. 26,000 killed in action, and about 43,000 who are wounded in action. So about 26 KIA, 43,000 who were wounded. Okay, there's a bit of variation in all these figures. The Soviet system, they come out with an official stat. They say they've lost 48,000 men. Okay, people started kind of like, particularly post collapse of the Iron Curtain kind of idea. People started crunching the numbers on this, and it looks now that you're looking at maybe somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 killed in action, Russian. Russian, and then with a kind of about another 200,000 that are wounded in action. So it's serious numbers, the serious disparity there.
So it's a huge. There's like 1 million people involved in this, and a couple of 100,000 people who are killed, and still, it's a war that probably almost everybody except the most devoted history buff knows almost nothing about.
Yeah, it's I suppose it's like comedy. It's all about timing, isn't it? It is when you look at newspapers of this period, and it's not just obviously Finnish newspapers, but if you look at American newspapers, they send journalists to this. They have British newspapers, French newspapers. There's a huge amount of media attention to this because obviously in Europe we've had the invasion of Poland, we have war in September. But then we have that period of the phony war where nothing is really happening. Sitzkrieg, as somebody referred to it later on, there's nothing really happening, and the emphasis, everybody's attention switches to Finland because we're looking at this country battling it out with one of the great powers at this time. But it essentially gets lost in the narrative because as this war is basically shut down in March with a peace treaty between the Soviets and the Finns. In May we have the Battle of France developing. And Battle of France, Fall of France, Dunkirk, and then the focus switches back to Europe, and then from Europe it switches to Battle of Britain, and then it's North Africa, and so on and so forth. So you're right, Rick. You've got in casualty wise, you're looking at about a couple of 100,000 people if you put it all in there, more if you take the larger figures, and about 1 million people involved. But it's lost. It's quite often it's just lost in history.
So one of the other things that's so fascinating is what is happening in the rest of the world. What is the reaction of, say, primarily Great Britain and France to the Soviet invasion, and what's Nazi Germany's, what's the reaction of these other warring powers? Because, as you say, there's another war going on while this little, quote unquote, little war is happening.
Yeah. It's basically France and Britain are looking at this, and their initial move is to send aid and money, aid in the terms of equipment. So, they will both send airplanes. Britain will send some more tanks that are not actually operational by the end. So they send food in terms of kind of humanitarian aid. Then they start sending materiel, bits and pieces. Also, some volunteers. There are American volunteers in this. A lot of them are Finnish descent who go back, several hundred of them. There are Swedish volunteers. The Swedes actually, in many ways, do the most amount in terms of trying to help Finland, in terms of they create a volunteer force that essentially is drawn from their army, but allows them to play with the whole neutrality thing and send people and a couple of air squadrons into Finland. But it starts ramping up too late. The British and the French come up with this idea of a scheme where they're going to send about 150,000 troops. They're going to land them in Norway. They're going to bring them through Sweden, and they're going to help Finland. Okay, this is the idea. And obviously, Norway and Sweden are not in the war at this time, and they kind of say, no, you're not sending troops to our territory. So, the kind of basically it's Field Marshal Ironside and the British on the British side. They're still developing their plan when war ends in the start of March 1940. And Mannerheim is involved in desperate negotiations, just wanting to send, will you send something, will you send stuff, will you give us some kind of aid, but they don't, Germany and Russia have, obviously, they've signed a non-aggression, that, Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement before they invade Poland. And that not only sees the division of Poland, but it also basically gives Soviet control of that sphere of influence, Baltics, Finland. So they do not get overtly involved. Germany does not overtly get involved in this. But you could argue that they are the beneficiaries of the whole situation. Because the Finns, by the time the war ends, the Finns are in a situation, they reckon they have no viable allies, really, on the French and the British side. They're just not coherent enough. So ergo, 1941, when Germany goes into Russia, Finland goes to war again and takes back lost territory, etc., etc.
At that point, Finland allies with Germany.
Yeah.
In that war, which is called the Continuation War, or sometimes I've heard the Completion War also. As a phrase.
It's an interesting for Finland. I mean, they have the Winter War, and they're never involved in World War II. They have the Winter War when they're fighting the Soviets. They have the Continuation War, and then they come to peace again with the Russians in '44.
So is it good naming that gets them keeps them out of trouble?
It keeps them out of the big trouble, Then they have the Lapland War, and that's to basically get the Germans out of Finland. So they go 360 in the space of a few years.
It is truly dizzying to try to read this and understand this. We have a bunch of questions. Chris, can I bring in a few?
Absolutely,
of these?
yeah.
And we all want to say we're sorry about the goal that Italy scored.
Thank you. Yeah, no problem. It's all under control.
We're moving on. So
I could hear shouting.
I could hear the shouting. Yes,
yeah.
It's 1-1. So one of the questions is: are there Finnish refugees from this? Is a question that was asked, and I would expand that to say, if not, that was Skip Cornett brought that up. If not, is there, what is the impact on Finnish civilian population, which I guess is probably pretty closely enmeshed with the military.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole narrative here. On two levels. Like, firstly, when the war breaks out, everybody falls back. There's a zone where they're going to let the Soviets advance before they try to oppose them. So there are whole areas, especially in the north, in the middle of the country, that are evacuated. People are moved. I think it's all in all about 450,000 people are moved internally. They are encouraged to burn their own houses and farms down.
Are you serious?
Leave nothing. Do not leave a shelter. Do not leave a stick standing for Russian troops. Wow. So people will actually do that. And you hear some amazing stories about kind of, some chap going back to go splashing his petrol over what remains of his farmhouse. And he's giving out that the army hasn't done a good enough job, so I'll actually burn my own house down better. But it's incredibly tough on the civilian population. Nearly 500,000 of them displaced. And then when the war ends, there is that basically Russia demands and gets that area in Karelia where the Mannerheim defenses are. So they get that. So there's more people displaced there.
Right, so you can see the areas here, the orange areas are the areas that Finland loses to Russia after fighting two wars with them during World War II, which somehow is not connected.
Yeah.
but is connected, yeah. So you can see that they lose that space down there by Leningrad, as well as some other space up there in the Lapland area.
Yeah. But I mean, again, I don't have numbers in this, but thousands also leave Finland and will head all across Europe. But a lot of them will head to the States because they look at the geography and they say the future. This is going to just keep happening to us. We're sandwiched up here beside the Russian bear. This is going to happen again. So thousands of people actually leave. But initially, in the wartime years, the great displacement is internally. It's people moving around.
So David, given obviously the Soviets win, they achieve some territorial objectives, but given how they've treated other countries that they move into, they don't take as much as you would think they would have ordinarily. Why is that? Why do you think, they only take those small buffer zones?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an area, there's a kind of like, that's the $10,000 question, really, in many ways. I mean, I think Stalin, to a certain extent, decides that he's satisfied because basically, having bitten off more than he can chew in 1939-40 with them, he doesn't want to push it that much further. I suppose he's thinking in the long-term game that if he can build up strength, he might be able to go again. But I think you look in the wider context of World War II. Obviously, Finland gets involved in what they termed the continuation war. By 1943, it's been signaled to them by from Washington through kind of like diplomatic links in Sweden that they should prosecute the war against Russia a little less enthusiastically. Well, particularly when you look at those northern regions, if the Germans have plans like this Operation Silver Fox and whatever else, they have plans to push in and take Leningrad, obviously, but also push in the north and try and take Murmansk and Archangel. They are routes that Allied convoys will bring so much material, so much equipment into Russia during World War II. So it signaled very clearly to the Finnish government that if you behave in this respect, you will be looked upon more kindly in any post-war world. So I think that factors into the, you look at post-World War II and Soviets are essentially allowed to do whatever they want in that the Baltic states and that kind of general region, but they do not come down heavy against Finland. And I think there has been a conversation there.
There's another question we have I want to bring in from Ross, which is how much of the Finns' equipment and supplies came from Russia through capture?
Well, I'll put it this way. They captured so much stuff, rifles, heavy machine guns, tanks. They actually didn't have people to give them to. Yeah, I mean, you're looking at locations where they took 10,000 rifles, 20,000 rifles. They actually didn't have enough trained soldiers to supply the weapons to. They capture dozens of tanks, dozens of T-26s. And this always surprises me. Many of these they actually keep and will then use against the Russians in the continuation war. Why they weren't allowed or made hand over all that heavy stuff that they captured, I have no idea, to be honest. But they capture, dozens of tanks, kind of like thousands of rifles, hundreds of machine guns, artillery pieces. All in all, they capture, in terms of troops, they capture 5,000-6,000 Soviet troops. And they hand those back at the end of the war. That's a condition of the treaty. They hand them back to Russia in April of 1940. And those people are generally sent to a gulag, and anybody of officer rank who was supposed to be responsible gets shot. About 200 or 300 of those get shot, So there we go.
A typical positive Russian, Russian
positive motivation.
Behavior there. Should I take one more question,
if you want,
Chris, from the audience, or do you have something you want to leap in with?
Well, I was just curious, given the fact that this war is fought out kind of while a larger war is going on, and given that the fighting continues on, does this war have any impact on how the larger war in the East is fought? I mean, are there lessons learned or things taken away? Does it have an impact on the rest of the war?
I think it does. I mean, in kind of like a key sense, I think when you look at towards the end of the war, how stretched the Germans are getting, and having troops right up in the Arctic Circle, campaigning with the Finns, trying to basically carry out major operations against the Russians, and then they get involved in a war with their former allies, the Lapland War. It's a level of complication that the Germans do not need at that time. And it's a level of drain on their resources that they cannot afford to have. And when you think of that alliance, not only are they trying to keep their own army sustained in Finland, they also have agreements of sending equipment and supplies to the Finns as well. So that has a larger strategic effect. It's just another drain that they don't need. I think in the longer lessons learned, kind of like when you take a really long view on this, I mean, various military academies, and I know West Point does this, used to teach various classes on the Finnish War, because it's such a very good case study of how to use terrain, geography, reasonably limited means, but you can actually mount a very good defense. It's that kind of like those kind of lessons learned do come out, and even kind of in terms of NATO exercises and some of the stuff that we still see going on now in the Baltic states with the forward NATO detachments up there. They do hark back to kind of looking at the Winter War. How can climate, how can terrain help us in a fight against an enemy that's more numerical than we will be? So yes. Yes, that's my answer.
Well, there you go. All right.
No, and I want to come back to that, but there's a great question here that a couple of people have asked, and I'll bring in Laura's version of it, which is, how are these events remembered in Finland today? How do the Finnish teach this, and what do they say about it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think in the last 20 years, we've seen, and there was a big memorialization project in Karelia that the Russians and the Finns cooperated on together. Okay, and so that was a moment of, noting the shared experience, the shared suffering, and a moment of peace and reconciliation, to want to use a better phrase. Okay, so there has been those, but I mean, for many years, I think there's a familiar trajectory. A lot of the people who've served in this war would have gone on to the continuation war. In post-World War II world, they didn't find themselves, I think, being very well remembered or recognized in society. Okay, that started shifting then, kind of in Cold War period. That started shifting once again. But when you look at how it's taught in schools, it's definitely on the curriculum now. And there's a particular area. There's actually the National Museum is up off the Rat Road where the major kind of action was. So there's a National Museum there. There are areas of the forest laid out so people can actually go and see what the terrain was that the fighting was in. I think it's something that every school class has to visit this. And the whole idea is not only kind of, it's not just kind of like, letting them in on the history, but giving them ideas of resilience and, how you should be thinking about, maybe your future conduct and the future history of the nation, that you have a part to play in this as well. But, and then there was kind of, I think in the 80s, 90s, there was also an effort made in terms of oral history to capture as many survivors as they could. So I suppose the short answer to that, Laura, is that it kind of went through that familiar kind of phase of being largely ignored, and then it was refound, and there's quite a bit of attention on it now.
So Dave, one of the things that I was curious about too is that, I mean, Russian's a pretty difficult language. Finnish, I guess, is a pretty difficult language. How do you go about researching a war like this that is so remote, with participants that speak odd, difficult languages? I mean, how do you?
Different languages. Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of, you're just a pure English speaker, you are helped along the way in a couple of different ways. There's a lot of newspaper coverage. There's a lot of newspaper coverage in English, and that'll give you a certain gist about what's going on. But also, I think because there was so much attention internationally, you will find there are files on this in Washington, in National Archives, Washington. There's files on this in Kew, outside of London, National Archives there. French have files on this, the Swedes, the Norwegians. There are various other kind of like nations that were watching this and also reckoned they were going to get dragged into it. That played a lot of very close kind of attention to this. So you will find English language sources. Moving a bit sideways, a bit further on from that, the Finnish archives are excellent. They've digitized an awful lot of material. Some of that material, there's commentaries in English, so you can start getting into that as well. The Russian is a bit more obscure in terms of problems with the records, as we might expect, and then also kind of like just access, cataloging, issues like that. The Russian material is harder to get at, but there's a lot of material, a lot of contemporary stuff there. And I'm sure if anybody's curious, they can always buy my book as well.
Well, but of course, if
absolutely.
they've read your book and been inspired, we want them to.
You can pre-order it on Amazon right now because it doesn't come out for a bit, but we urge you to do so. But I want to. Chris asked about impact, but there's a couple of ways in which this war could be viewed. You refer to it in the subtitle of your book as Stalin's hollow victory, which makes it sound like it didn't help the Soviets very much. On the other hand, you could make an argument that this war kind of gave the Soviets a wake up call about the quality of their army, kind of helped them to, forced them to find decent commanders, and at the same time, perhaps induced overconfidence in the Germans and made them a little bit more confident of their ability to defeat the Soviet Union, which ended up not working out so well for them. So kind of where do you stand on all that?
I think all those aspects hold true. I mean, I think the easy way to look at quite often we look at the Russian army as though it's monoglot, it's all the same. But what's very apparent in this kind of like this phase is in terms of the troops, in terms of the commanders, there's a lot of different populations there. There's some very highly experienced and very effective people. I mean, in around the same time as this, you've got the whole Manchurian campaign against the Japanese, and you got Zhukov out there being quite successful. So why can Zhukov run a modern maneuver, kind of like an armor, kind of like operation, but the guys in kind of like Finland can't? Why is that so? So there are different kind of populations, different officers. This will force them into a massive rethink. And obviously, when you look at how to even end the war, you bring in Timoshenko, the future Marshal Timoshenko, to come and basically reorganize everything, which he does quite effectively, retrain his troops so they can actually win this war. They can use their numbers to win the war. Now, after the war itself, they are actually going through a period of reassessment. They are actually kind of reorganizing, re-equipping, trying to reintroduce the doctrine, try to improve leadership right down to NCO level. But they really don't have time to complete that process by the time Barbarossa kicks off the following year. It's just they are at a pace trying to do it, but we haven't completed it. From the German perspective, absolutely. I mean, if you look, this is a great shot in the arm to your self-confidence, isn't it? Really, if you look at this, if you're looking at the European context, and you look at the Soviet Union as perhaps your greatest adversary, and then they run an operation against a tiny country, and they win, but they are totally flittered, as we would say here, in trying to win. They're totally flittered. So that's a huge boost in and this plays into German planning. I mean, what the Germans look back at their own experience in knocking Russia out of the war in World War One, and then they look at this situation in Finland, and all of a sudden they kind of say, "Yeah, Russia's doable. Yeah, we can do this." I mean, they're put on, and this comes out in the literature or even comments at the time. What is it the Germans say? The whole one kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will collapse. They think the Russians are incompetent. Finland supports that kind of consensus.
Well, David, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Chris.
No. So, one of the things that you bring to the table is you have written about all manner of military topics. Your expertise and knowledge is broad. You've written about Lawrence of Arabia and the American Civil War and Renaissance figures, so you have a pretty solid grounding in military history. Is there anything when you were researching this that kind of surprised you or struck you as particularly interesting about this, or different, or just this stood out for you?
Yeah, I think that the thing that stood out to me most of all was just the level of training, I think, within the Finnish Army. That's quite small, quite under-resourced, but they have and it boils down to maybe, I would say, across the entire army, you're probably looking at 50 individuals who actually create a system of training that is so effective, focusing on local offensives, wargaming, doing kind of like peacetime war games over areas that they think may be targeted, may be invaded. And this, some of these war games are just officers. They're just like, it's a staff ride. It's 20 officers go out to look at the ground and see how they're going to handle an invasion. So I think it was quite surprising because in many ways the narrative is that they're not being resourced and the army is not effective. But you can see there is a cohort within it trying to prep for defence and training very, very effectively right down to corporal level. That level of detail, which just makes it so much easier for them to defend when the Soviets come across the line. I think that was the standout for me. Was just, you come away from it kind of looking at, in modern contexts, and armies look for metrics of training and education and so on and so forth. And this is actually quite basic, common sense kind of stuff, but they do it very, very effectively.
Well, David Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the Soviet-Finnish War, or as the title of your book has it, the Finnish-Soviet Winter War, and it definitely was in winter, which has got some great maps in it as well and some great illustrations and really kind of breaks down a lot of stuff and is available for pre-order on Amazon, and I'm sure will be available in lots of other places. And we appreciate, you are a 2-time guest. We don't have a 3-time guest yet, but you're in the running.
Yeah.
What do I have to do? Who do I have to kill?
Well, we need some good audience feedback here on whether we should bring you back. And then, if it works out, it works out. What can I say?
Check us in the post, boys.
David Murphy, thank you so much for joining
David.
us. Well, Chris, that was a fun episode. It was fun talking to David Murphy. He is always so knowledgeable and has such a lot of personality as well.
It's one of our great History Happy Hour alum.
And, we couldn't do History Happy Hour without the help of all of our Patreon supporters, our patrons, and especially our Top Shelf patrons. And, if you become a Top Shelf patron, you get a mention on History Happy Hour. And here are the Top Shelf patrons. And there's upper left is Matt Brogy, who's off on the road right now, leading tours and doing such things. But we appreciate the help, and you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour and slapping your money down. I mean, that's what you have to do.
And remember, folks, we like small fonts, so help us just squeeze in a few more names.
Right, we can make those smaller and smaller, or go for the flip page where we flip to the next page.
Ooh, one can only hope.
If we got enough patrons, we could open that bottle and it could start bubbling over. I mean, we could do it with the animation and stuff.
Yeah.
So we could have it.
That was almost like the time you did what was it, the British soldier falling over animation.
Oh yes,
Which,
for Rev.
I thought I forgot about that. Yeah, you forgot.
I had forgotten about it.
You forgot Revnov, not
Thanks
I,
a lot,
pal.
because I was glad that I had forgotten about it. Well, and next week we are going to be coming to you live with the courtesy of French Wi-Fi from the Cotentin Peninsula, which is, where some certain things happened on June 6, 1944, and we're going to be talking about some of those things. And about the commander of the Allied forces, Dwight Eisenhower, and his legendary book, Crusade in Europe, which is out in a new edition, and chatting about that and its relevance for us today, and kind of, I guess what I would say is some of Eisenhower's far-sightedness.
Absolutely.
It holds up pretty well reading it 80 years later.
And much like your History Happy Hour hosts, oldies but goodies. Crusade in Europe.
I'm so happy to be compared with Eisenhower.
That's right. Well, if you can't be one,
So anyway, thanks very much for joining us today.
Everyone.
Come back next week, everybody.
Be safe.